Would you please pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Pentecost, another one of these crazy, supernatural sorts of stories from the Scriptures, like Transfiguration Sunday or a whole mess of other stories that just seem like they're too crazy to be real, maybe the resurrection even. And so we have these guys sitting in a room, and when I say guys, I actually mean men and women and probably children, because I do not think that it was only dudes that were following Jesus around that were in these moments. I think it was a wide variety of people. And so they're all in this room together when this moment happens. Let's backtrack a little bit in their time to figure out the mindset they might have at this moment. So they've been following Jesus around for a couple of years, some of them probably longer than others. And he's sort of a rabbi that has gone his own little direction, and they're all infatuated with him, think he's the Son of God, and then all of a sudden he's captured, crucified, and died. But then he comes back to life 3 days later, and he's kind of with them and not with them, and we see in the gospel story there what that looks like a week later. When they know Jesus is resurrected, where do they find themselves? In a locked room, right? Hiding. Because they're scared of the Jews. They are Jews, but they're scared of all the other Jews. I mean, think about this. If they killed your master, that's not good for you, the follower, right? So they're scared, and Jesus says, "Go, I send you." So then we find them 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, 5 weeks later, here in our story for today. And where are they? They're still in the stinking room. I think that's kind of funny. They did not get it. And so apparently Jesus showing up with wounds in his hands and side and feet wasn't enough to get them out of the room. So what does God send them? Wind and fire. That would get your attention, I would think. It would get my attention. If I see wind and fire to those levels in the next couple of weeks, it will get my attention. But here's the unique thing. So these people that are there in this room, these Jesus followers, I have to think they're a fairly homogenous group of people. They look the same, they think the same, they're from the same sort of cultural milieu, they're all Jews, they probably all speak the same languages, and they're in Jerusalem, this widely diverse city. So do you see the beauty of what God does in this moment? They're all doing the same thing, in the same place, hiding, and God gives them all the gift of other languages. Guess what the gift of other languages doesn't do? Help you stay in your room and keep talking to the same people. The only thing you can do with the gift of other languages is go outside and tell the world about all that you've experienced. I think this is the place that we are in now as the church. So I read a book recently called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. And the first page starts out something like this. For 1,700 years, the church has had the privileged place of being the center of culture. Ever since Constantine made the Roman Empire a Christian culture, Christianity has been at the center of culture. And he references back in the 60s, saying that if you read the LA Times in the 60s, some of the biggest articles were the Warren Commission, the happenings of the biggest non-denominational church in Los Angeles, and the daily Bible readings. Can you imagine a newspaper like that now? Bible readings in the Beaver County Times? All that is to say that Christianity, we, the church, are not the center of the world any longer. We see this in our pews. 50 years ago, these pews were full because it was expected that you'd be in church. That expectation is no longer the case. And so this book, Canoeing the Mountains, argues that for the first time in history, everything is changing so rapidly and the place of the church is so different that everything needs to be rethought. Everything we thought we knew to get to this point is great and it got us here, but it won't get us to the next place. And all along the book, he uses the analogy of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Who likes history? Some of you people, I knew you liked history. Are you familiar with the Lewis and Clark expedition? Oh, yes. So you know that back 300 years ago, or was it about 300 years ago? Lewis and Clark, they were tasked with finding a water route from the Mississippi River, because that's about as far west as anyone had ever really been, to the Pacific Ocean. And for hundreds of years, ever since they found the new world here, cartographers, geographers imagined that if you went west, you'd find mountains, but they'd be like the Appalachian Mountains, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 foot peaks. And if you went west far enough, you'd have to go over those peaks, but then you'd find a nice river down to the Pacific Ocean. And so Lewis and Clark were tasked with this job, to go up the Missouri River, find those 4,000 or 5,000 foot peaks like the Appalachians, pick up your canoes, and then maybe carry them over the peak, and then put your canoe back down in the water and just ride down the river into the Pacific Ocean. So they set off up the Missouri River, and a year and a half later, after spending the winter in the Dakotas with the Indians, they finally got to the end of the Missouri River. They say there was this moment where a person could put one foot on one bank and the other foot on the other side of the bank and stand there with the Missouri River between their legs. And there was a peak that they had to climb up beyond that. And so Lewis and Clark went up to the top of this peak so they could look over and see the half-day journey of carrying their canoes and see the river. They'd go back down. But what did they find? More mountains. And not Appalachian mountains that were 5,000 feet. They found 10,000-foot mountains, 14,000-foot mountains, as far as the eye could see. Meriwether Lewis wrote. Can you imagine the heartbreak, the hurt, everything you've been trained to think? The very foundation of your expedition is now gone. You can't carry the canoes over those things. They decide, as a whole expedition, that they need to tear up the canoes, break them up. They can't carry them anywhere. It's a great analogy for where we are right now. Now, friends, I think we are in our canoes, and we're at the foot of the mountains, and we can, like headstrong people, try to carry our canoes into the future, or we can decide to break them up and do something different or do something new. And I don't know what that looks like exactly. Our council, unfortunately, does not have the magic thing either. And the book didn't give me the answer either. I thought that once he set this great metaphor up, it would just give me the answers for what to do to go over the mountains. One fascinating analogy in the book is they start listening to the Indians on advice on how to get through the mountains. They borrow horses from the Indians. There's a 19-year-old mother who becomes their trail guide through the mountains. Her name is Sacagawea, exactly, who has a baby early on in the expedition and then takes her baby through the mountains on this expedition. Talk about listening to a new voice, a woman's voice, 300 years ago. A 19-year-old new mother's voice. I think this is where we are now. And I think this is a good time for me to take a sabbatical and think about these things, for our council to take some time and think about these things, because truly we are. I made Jeff read this book too, so he's like he might come up and finish the sermon here after we finish. And let me say that I think this is an exciting time to be the church. The church, I don't think, even though it's been 1,700 years of being the center of culture, the church shouldn't be the center of culture. It wasn't in Jesus' day, and I think we thrive when we are not the center. We can go back to being who we are. And now is the time for us to be who we are. And it is an exciting time. And so this will be a big part of my reflections over the next 3 months, thinking about this reality. And let me tell you, all that I learned in seminary, it's a great canoe, but it's not what I need to go over the next set of mountains. He uses that analogy in the book too because he's a seminary professor. He's like, unfortunately, we've taught pastors all the wrong things. We've taught them what they need to get here, but not what they need to get to the next thing. So I need to do some reflection time, and so do we all in this moment. All right, so I'm going to change gears here for the end of this sermon, having presented that as the place we are stepping off on today. And let me say that it's often, I think, the role of the pastor, or at least it seems to be the relationship between me and you all, that I am your pastor and caregiver, and therefore I'm the one that always gives you care. But let me say that in the 9 years I've been here, you have given me a great deal of care. I walked in here as a person who'd never had a full-time job other than going to school, and a person who had lots of book smarts about school, and you have let me do stuff and fail, and do stuff and succeed. And you've watched me struggle and do well, and you've walked with me all this way. And so I want to say thank you. To each one of you in particular, I could go around and say something about each one of you, about how you've helped me to be a better person, husband, father, pastor. But I want to say thank you to all of you for the ways in which you've cared for me, He's not here, and actually, other than Kay, the whole family isn't here. But I want to say one amazing word about Craig Bichek, who's not here. But as we were getting ready for his wedding a year or so ago, Jacob had a baseball game that morning. Went to the game. My parents actually came down, and we're standing awkwardly in the parking lot like an hour before the wedding. I said, well, I got to go to this wedding now. My mom's like, yeah, so my cancer's back. And I'm like, okay, I got to go. And then I mean, how do you hear that the second time in a couple years, and then come to be here for this wedding and be this ball of excitement? And so I was in the sacristy back there, and I'm like, Mike, you got to get this out of you right now, or you will fall apart in the middle of this wedding. While you're trying to say the words of like lifelong promises to each other, I'm going to just start crying. So I'm sitting back there in the sacristy. I'm like, all right, let it go. I just start flooding out with tears and weeping about this reality. And all of a sudden, I mean, this is like 10 minutes before the wedding starts. Craig walks in. He's like, oh my goodness, Pastor, what's wrong? And I can't even talk. And so Greg, who is the assistant minister, tells him that I just found out my mom had cancer. You know what Craig did? He ran to me those couple steps and just embraced me and held me. No words, just held me. That is a microcosm of how you all have cared for me over these 9 years. You have just held me at times, and I'm so thankful for all of you for that. I'm looking forward to this time of reflection. I'm looking forward to coming back and doing some new things with you all. Thank you. Amen.